In the forgotten hollows of Kentucky, there existed a lineage unlike any other, a brotherhood bound not by pride, but by the tightening grip of bloodlines turning back on themselves. Imagine a tree of men so tangled, so unnervingly circular, it resembled not growth, but collapse. At the core of this brotherhood stood a man named Charlie Fugate. By the time he drew his final breath in 1975, Charlie embodied the result of generations of men refusing outside ties. His existence became less a story of survival and more a cautionary tale written in bone and blood. This is not simply history. It's the unraveling of human genetics, one union between men after another, building toward a collapse no one could reverse. Tonight, we uncover how generations of fathers, sons, brothers, and uncles engineered their own downfall, and how one man became the symbol of their end. If you're drawn to strange, unsettling histories of men who pushed human limits, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more, and share it with a brother who enjoys uncovering the darkest corners of the past. In the early 1800s, a solitary man named Martin Fugate wandered into the wild mountains of Kentucky. He carried little more than determination, hardened spirit, and a genetic secret that would shape generations of men. Martin was no ordinary settler. His blood carried a rare mutation, one that subtly changed the very chemistry of his body. Unseen at first, this mutation would emerge violently in his sons, marking them forever. The isolated valley became Martin's kingdom, a place where men could live without interference from distant towns or authority. Here, fathers raised sons, brothers stood by brothers, and uncles forged a lineage bound tightly together. Without outsiders nearby, the bloodline turned inward. Sons grew into men, men took roles as fathers, and brothers bound their future to one another. Generation after generation, men created unions within their own brotherhood. The first sons born of Martin's blood carried strange signs. Their skin revealed a deep bluish tone, unlike any other men in the mountains. Locals whispered of curses, while doctors spoke of mutations. But whispers carried little weight in the hollows. What mattered was survival. Men labored together, hunted the forests, and guarded their mountain paths. Outsiders rarely entered, and even fewer stayed long among them. As decades passed, the Fugate men clung to their secluded way of life. Sons became fathers, fathers became grandfathers, and each generation bound itself tighter to the last. The bloodline grew circular, closed upon itself. Doctors who stumbled upon these men recorded strange features, unusual skin, deformities, and vacant expressions. Yet despite their notes, the men refused to change. They believed their brotherhood was destined, chosen, unbreakable. Uncles stood proudly beside nephews, declaring their lineage pure. Brothers swore loyalty to brothers, sons obeyed fathers, and grandfathers enforced tradition. The Fugate men embraced the curse, making it their badge of distinction. By the late 1800s, their tree of men had twisted into a loop. Marriages of brothers to nephews, uncles to sons, and grandfathers to grandsons blurred the boundaries of blood until all were nearly identical. The few doctors who dared return described horrors beyond imagination. Sons unable to speak, infants deformed, men with organs twisted beyond recognition. Yet the Fugate line endured, each father insisting his son continue the bond. Isolation became their prison. With no outside men willing to join their ranks, the cycle deepened. Brothers united with brothers, grandfathers claimed grandsons, and the lineage folded in on itself like collapsing stone. Each generation intensified the mark. Sons were born more blue, more frail, more unlike any others in Kentucky. Still, the men stood together, convinced their path was righteous, ordained by their ancestors. The world beyond the valley began whispering about them, not as men, but as monsters. Yet inside the hollows, they dismissed the rumors. To them, they were proud sons of a chosen brotherhood. Men of the Fugate line saw strength in survival, not shame in deformity. They built cabins, farmed land, and raised sons who would inherit not only property, but the burden of their cursed blood. When questioned, grandfathers defended their choices. They spoke of unity, of brothers keeping their bond unbroken. Outsiders, they claimed, carried weakness. Only Fugate blood, passed through men alone, could remain strong and eternal. The first century of their brotherhood carved a destiny impossible to escape. By choosing themselves, the Fugate men created a path leading not outward but downward, into collapse, generation by generation, son by son. At the heart of this downward spiral, a boy would one day be born. His name would echo through medical records and whispers alike. Charlie Fugate, the embodiment of a lineage unraveling in blue. The birth of Martin's sons marked a turning point. They entered the world carrying skin not of flesh-toned hues, but of cold indigo. Fathers whispered prayers, while brothers stared in fearful silence. These boys grew into men, yet their blue skin drew constant suspicion. Locals branded them cursed, while mountain preachers muttered of unnatural blood. Among themselves, however, the Fugate brothers saw strength in their difference. Grandfathers reminded the younger men that blue skin was not weakness, but distinction. "We are chosen," they said. And so the brothers wore their color as both warning and emblem. When outsiders arrived, they recoiled. Hunters passing through valleys whispered about blue-skinned men wandering forests. Traders avoided paths leading into Fugate territory. Isolation tightened, and the brotherhood sealed its boundaries even further. Yet survival demanded continuation. With no outsiders joining their numbers, fathers arranged bonds between sons, uncles, and nephews. What began as necessity hardened into ritual, a cycle binding men only to each other. The next generation of sons carried even darker shades. Infants appeared with deeper tones of indigo, sometimes so intense that onlookers crossed themselves in fear. Still, the men raised them proudly as rightful heirs. Doctors who examined these sons recorded notes of shock. Skin darker than sky, hearts pumping strangely thick blood, minds developing slowly. Yet the Fugate men refused outside correction, rejecting medicine as intrusion. Uncles boasted that their blue sons were stronger than others. They plowed fields, felled trees, and survived winters that crushed outsiders. The mutation, they claimed, made them harder, more enduring, more united as brothers. But alongside this pride came undeniable decline. Some sons never learned to speak clearly. Others stumbled with twisted spines, unable to stand long without pain. Each year, the curse deepened across their brotherhood. Despite evidence of collapse, Fugate men doubled down. They saw deformities as trials from destiny. Fathers insisted that blue sons carried sacred blood, and so the cycle of inner unions remained unbroken. As decades rolled on, every Fugate boy was marked. None escaped the curse. Their skin became the signature of their brotherhood, a visible reminder that their lineage had turned wholly inward. Traveling preachers told stories of devil men in the mountains. Government officials heard rumors of strange blue sons hidden away. Yet rarely did outsiders brave the hollows, for the Fugate men guarded their land fiercely. Each generation of sons was raised with the same command: remain within, never dilute the blood. Brothers swore oaths to one another, ensuring no stranger's seed would ever enter their lineage. Grandfathers passed these lessons like scripture. Our sons are our legacy, they declared. Only through ourselves shall we endure. And the boys, growing into men, obeyed without hesitation or doubt. But beneath the surface, collapse brewed. The very blood that bound them also weakened them. With every new union between brothers and nephews, the genetic rope frayed further, strand by fragile strand. Some doctors whispered that the Fugate lineage had become a living experiment. Sons showed conditions unseen elsewhere: malformed bones, sluggish minds, and strange circulations. To science, they were anomalies. To themselves, proud sons. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Blue Sons had become infamous, even beyond Kentucky. Men spoke their name with awe, pity, or horror. Yet still, inside the hollows, the brotherhood endured. What began with Martin's sons had become tradition, and from that tradition would eventually emerge the most infamous of all, Charlie Fugate, a boy who would carry every flaw of his forefathers. The Fugate men no longer viewed their condition as accident. By the late 19th century, they considered themselves architects of destiny. Each father commanded his sons, bind within, strengthen blood, and never break tradition. Uncles guided nephews through rituals of inheritance, teaching them that the true measure of loyalty was unity with brothers. Outsiders, they claimed, weakened lineages. Only through men alone could their dynasty remain eternal. The Fugate cabins echoed with vows. Brothers swore before grandfathers that no foreign blood would enter. Fathers told sons that their duty was continuation, even if their bodies bore marks of collapse. Each generation tightened the circle. Brothers bonded to nephews. Grandfathers united with grandsons. The bloodline folded upon itself until each new boy resembled not a branch of the tree, but the tree repeated. Doctors who ventured into the hollows recorded scenes like nothing in medical literature. Sons born with cleft features, twisted spines, and vacant eyes, yet still raised proudly by fathers who proclaimed them heirs. What began as survival had transformed into devotion. Fugate men took pride in their indigo legacy, treating blue skin as proof of chosen blood. Their dynasty grew not wider but denser, like stone compressed. Fathers instructed sons that hardship was proof of strength. If boys limped, they endured. If brothers spoke slowly, they were still worthy. The dynasty did not demand perfection, only loyalty to the blood. By 1880, the Fugate brotherhood had become legend in mountain towns. Whispers told of men marrying nephews, uncles binding to brothers, and grandfathers claiming grandsons. To outsiders, it was horror. To them, sacred order. The dynasty's pride blinded them to decay. Sons increasingly displayed deformities too severe to ignore. Yet fathers declared these flaws merely burdens of greatness. Grandfathers reminded them that chosen men must bear chosen suffering. Isolation fueled the cycle. Roads were scarce, outsiders few, and commerce minimal. Surrounded only by brothers, the Fugate men had little choice but to continue inward, turning each new generation into copies of the last. A preacher once paid to perform a binding ceremony noted in private that the union resembled a closed circle rather than a new branch. The dynasty, he said, resembled stone grinding itself to dust. Still, the men persisted. They built their homesteads, worked their fields, and passed instructions from fathers to sons. Remain within, carry the name, preserve the mark. Their dynasty was both cage and crown. Government officials received reports of unnatural births, but no action followed. The hollows remained too remote. Thus the Fugate men continued, unchallenged, weaving their dynasty deeper into genetic collapse. By the turn of the 20th century, their unions had reached unimaginable proximity. Some boys were born with bloodlines so overlapping they resembled living mirrors of their fathers. Identity blurred, yet the dynasty continued proudly. The dynasty no longer produced wide branches but narrow chains. Each boy born bore nearly identical blood to his father and brother. To the outside world it was a warning, to them, triumph. Medical men who studied their records declared the Fugates examples of extreme inbreeding, unprecedented among humans. Yet within the hollows, fathers told sons these same records proved resilience. They were not collapsing, they were enduring. But endurance carried a cost. By creating a dynasty closed upon itself, the Fugates had ensured that one day a single man would bear every flaw, every weakness, every broken strand of their legacy. That man would soon arrive. His name was Charlie Fugate, and he would become the living symbol of a dynasty that had spent generations grinding its bloodline into collapse. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Fugate dynasty had become an echo chamber of its own blood. Fathers bound sons, uncles bound nephews, and grandfathers sealed unions that closed the circle tighter. The men no longer questioned their choices. Generations of brothers had been raised to see collapse not as danger, but as heritage. Flaws became symbols, deformities became trials, and blue skin became their crown. Yet the consequences grew impossible to ignore. Sons were born with twisted limbs, brittle bones, and hearts that faltered before manhood. Still, fathers lifted them proudly, declaring them heirs of an unbroken brotherhood. Doctors visiting the hollows scribbled notes describing horrors of nature. Some boys could barely walk, others never learned words beyond broken sounds. But everyone was claimed, raised, and bound as rightful continuation. The spiral showed in their faces. Some brothers bore features nearly identical to their fathers, as if the dynasty had run out of new designs. Bloodlines overlapped until individuality dissolved into repetition. Uncles told nephews these marks were proof of chosen blood. "Our line is strong," they declared. "We suffer because we endure." Sons nodded, their faith drilled deep by tradition and unbroken loyalty. Isolation gave the Fugates no escape. Roads were few, outsiders scarce, and opportunities to bring in new men non-existent. The hollows themselves became both fortress and prison, forcing the cycle deeper each generation. Whispers reached nearby towns. Hunters spoke of malformed blue boys glimpsed near rivers. Preachers described cursed men born of sin. But few dared intrude, for the Fugates guarded their territory with fierce resolve. Some officials attempted investigations, but rough terrain and hostile reception ended most efforts. The dynasty remained sealed, free to continue its rituals of self-destruction beneath the mountains' silence and secrecy. By now, the spiral had produced horrors unspoken even among themselves. Some boys survived only days, their bodies incapable of sustaining life. Others lingered in pain, carried by fathers who refused to abandon them. Still, the cycle endured. Each generation pressed forward, fathers binding sons to nephews, uncles uniting with grandsons. The Fugates saw no alternative. To them, breaking the cycle meant betrayal of brotherhood. Medical men later described their bloodline as collapsing inward, like a star consuming itself until only darkness remained. But within the hollows, the Fugate men insisted they were unbreakable. Grandfathers stood as keepers of tradition. Their voices carried weight, commanding obedience from every son. "This is our way," they repeated. "We have endured generations, and we will endure forever." But forever came with cracks. By the early 1900s, the dynasty had produced men so damaged they could barely function. Outsiders called them tragedies. Insiders called them sacred burdens. The spiral tightened mercilessly. Each son born carried greater weight than the last. Shoulders hunched, eyes vacant, organs twisted, yet fathers pressed them forward. The dynasty demanded continuation, no matter the suffering etched into each body. Outsiders' fascination grew. Scientists whispered about experiments of nature, brothers so entwined their blood resembled mirrors. Yet none intervened. The Fugates were too isolated, too defensive, and too bound to their heritage. As the spiral tightened, anticipation rose. Observers wondered how far the brotherhood could collapse before reaching absolute ruin. The answer would come soon, in the form of one boy named Charlie. Charlie Fugate's birth would prove the spiral's breaking point, the moment when generations of inward blood finally revealed their ultimate consequence, creating the most infamous figure the dynasty had ever produced. In 1912, a boy was born into the Fugate dynasty, whose very existence embodied centuries of spiraling blood. His name was Charlie, and from the moment of birth whispers surrounded him. Charlie entered the world not merely blue, but indigo. His skin carried a shade so deep that men present crossed themselves instinctively. Grandfathers muttered of curses, while fathers saw only continuity of lineage. Doctors recorded his arrival with horror. His body bore twisted limbs, and his face carried distortions unknown in medical books. Yet despite shock, the Fugate men lifted him proudly as rightful descendant. Charlie's father, himself a product of brother-to-brother binding, insisted his son was proof of resilience. Though malformed, he was alive, and that alone was celebrated as strength in the Fugate brotherhood. As Charlie grew, it became clear his mind developed slowly. Words came rarely, replaced by grunts and gestures. Still, uncles encouraged him, telling others he carried sacred blood even if thoughts lagged behind. Doctors who visited later described Charlie's body as evidence of genetic collapse. His bones bent strangely, his eyes lacked brightness, his gait unsteady. Yet the Fugates ignored such observations, focused solely on survival. Grandfathers taught Charlie that he was chosen, that blue skin was his inheritance. They raised him not as tragedy, but as symbol of endurance, instructing him always to preserve the dynasty. Despite his limitations, Charlie matured into manhood. Though he could not read or write, though his speech faltered, the men around him declared his purpose was clear: to continue the brotherhood. By adolescence, Charlie's role was already planned. Fathers whispered among themselves, arranging his future. He would be bound to one of his own grandsons, sealing the dynasty in an unprecedented circle. Charlie's presence unsettled outsiders. Men who glimpsed him recoiled at his indigo skin and twisted body. To them, he resembled something unnatural. But within the hollows, he was revered as heir. The Fugate men spoke of him with pride. "Charlie is proof we endure," they declared. "He is what our blood has forged." Their words ignored the suffering etched into his frame. Doctors later estimated Charlie's genetic collapse surpassed nearly all recorded cases. His blood resembled closed loops rather than branching lines. To science, he was an anomaly. To his brotherhood, a continuation. Uncles tasked with guiding Charlie often struggled. His learning was minimal, his abilities limited. Yet they persisted, drilling loyalty, reminding him daily that his role was to bind, not question. Charlie's existence became both warning and promise. Outsiders saw a boy crumbling under centuries of inbreeding. Insiders saw the living embodiment of tradition, proof that their dynasty could not be broken. By early adulthood, Charlie had grown strong enough to labor. He worked fields, hauled timber, and endured winters. Each task performed became evidence for brothers that he was capable of bearing lineage forward. Still, cracks deepened. His health wavered, his body weakened easily. But no matter his fragility, the Fugates insisted his duty outweighed discomfort. His bloodline was more important than any individual hardship. Charlie's name spread quietly beyond Kentucky. Scientists heard rumors of a blue-skinned man, malformed yet surviving. They sought him as case study, but few reached him. Within the hollows, he remained guarded. The stage was set. Charlie had grown, burdened with centuries of spiraling blood. Soon, his role would expand, and the dynasty would bind him into its darkest chapter, a union with his own grandson. By 1930, Charlie had reached adulthood. His body bore the marks of collapse, yet his destiny had been decided long before. The Fugate dynasty would bind him to his own grandson. The men whispered of this binding as necessity. With no outsiders welcomed, the dynasty had run out of distant uncles or cousins. The only path forward was inward, uniting Charlie with his descendant. A preacher for hire was summoned. Paid in silence, he stood before the Fugate men, reciting words of union while knowing the arrangement violated every natural law. Yet the brothers in attendance cheered solemnly. The ceremony was simple. Charlie, twisted yet proud, stood beside his grandson. Around them, fathers, brothers, and uncles witnessed what they saw as continuation. No man protested. The dynasty demanded obedience. Outsiders would have recoiled in horror. A grandfather binding with his own grandson was beyond comprehension. But inside the hollows, this moment was celebrated as sacred preservation of Fugate blood. The preacher later wrote privately that the sight haunted him. Yet money bought his silence. To the Fugates, he was just another man fulfilling duty, bearing witness to their brotherhood's choice. Charlie, barely capable of understanding, accepted the role laid before him. Guided by uncles, urged by grandfathers, he stepped into a union designed not for love, but for pure continuity. The grandson chosen mirrored Charlie's blood almost completely. In genetic terms, they were reflections, nearly identical. Doctors later said such a match broke boundaries of biology, collapsing diversity into near-perfect duplication. Yet the Fugate men celebrated. "We are stronger together," they declared. "No outsider will break us." They saw the union not as atrocity, but as triumph, binding themselves into an unbreakable circle. That night, the cabins echoed with songs of endurance. Brothers raised cups, grandfathers nodded proudly, and fathers declared that the dynasty had secured its path forward. In their eyes, Charlie had fulfilled destiny. But destiny came at cost. Medical records later revealed their children would carry flaws magnified beyond imagination: twisted spines, collapsed lungs, malformed skulls, every defect of ancestry compacted into fragile new lives. Doctors who examined the offspring described them as barely human, bodies incapable of sustaining normal function. Yet the Fugate men lifted these boys as heirs, insisting they were rightful sons of chosen blood. The union sealed Charlie's role in history. Outsiders who heard of it whispered about curses and sins, while scientists viewed it as unparalleled evidence of human collapse. Yet within, it remained sacred. Charlie himself seemed unaware of the horror his binding represented. With limited understanding, he lived simply, following instructions, laboring when able, and fathering sons who would suffer under the dynasty's genetic burden. The preacher who had officiated never returned. Fear, disgust, or guilt consumed him. Yet he remained silent. To reveal the truth risked ridicule, for few would believe such a union had occurred. The Fugates, however, spoke of it proudly. Around fires, uncles told stories of Charlie's binding as proof of their loyalty to tradition. They saw themselves as chosen guardians of their unique brotherhood. But scientists later described this moment as the dynasty's darkest chapter. By uniting Charlie with his own grandson, the Fugates had driven their lineage past survival into the realm of collapse. The forbidden union ensured that Charlie's name would echo forever, not as legend of endurance, but as symbol of genetic ruin, the man who married his grandson and sealed the dynasty's fate. From the binding of Charlie and his grandson came sons whose bodies carried the full weight of 8 generations. These boys were not simply blue, they were broken echoes of collapsing blood. Doctors who examined them described twisted spines, malformed skulls, and organs arranged in unnatural ways. Yet despite shock, the Fugate men lifted each son proudly, declaring them rightful heirs of their chosen brotherhood. Some boys could not walk, their legs bent beyond function. Others could not speak, their mouths shaped strangely. A few survived only weeks, yet each was claimed as proof of the dynasty's continuation. The Fugate men refused outside help. Medicine was dismissed as weakness. Fathers insisted their blue sons were stronger for surviving deformities. Grandfathers preached endurance, teaching boys that pain itself was inheritance. Uncles guided the surviving sons through harsh mountain life. Even those crippled by frailty were pressed into labor, hauling wood, tending fires, and surviving winters as demonstrations of fugate resilience. The outside world grew fascinated. Reports of sons born barely functioning reached medical circles. Scientists described them as living experiments, yet the Fugates themselves treated them as honored brothers within their dynasty. Some records told of boys with lungs that barely filled, blood that thickened unnaturally, or eyes that failed to focus. Still, their fathers insisted they carried the sacred mark of blue. Each new birth deepened collapse. The sons born to Charlie's union carried bloodlines so identical their DNA resembled reflections. Geneticists later described them as closer than laboratory clones bred for research. Despite suffering, the Fugates never broke. They defended their choices fiercely. Outsiders called them cursed. Insiders called them chosen. Each son, however deformed, was hailed as a sacred bearer of blood. Grandfathers lectured that hardship was divine proof. "We carry the weight because we endure," they told the boys. And so even the weakest among them were celebrated as victories, not failures. The dynasty pressed forward, ignoring consequences. Sons died young, but others lived long enough to continue the cycle. Each survival was seized as proof their lineage was unbreakable despite endless collapse. Doctors later documented cases of mental stagnation so severe that some boys never advanced beyond infant-like awareness. Yet brothers cared for them, insisting their presence was vital to the dynasty's unity. The Fugate Hollows became a gallery of human suffering. Boys limped, groaned, and faltered, yet everyone was paraded as heritage. Their lives testified to loyalty stronger than the natural order. Outsiders wondered how long the dynasty could sustain itself. Could sons born with such collapse truly carry forward the bloodline? Yet inside, fathers saw no choice but continuation. Breaking tradition was unthinkable. Even as their bodies failed, the sons were forced into unions. Grandfathers arranged bonds between crippled boys and younger brothers. The cycle demanded continuation, even if collapse had already consumed nearly everything. Scientists later concluded that these sons represented the closest humans had come to total genetic implosion. Their DNA looked shattered, a closed loop where variation no longer existed. Yet the dynasty persisted. Charlie's binding had given the world sons unlike any other. Sons who stood as the living ruins of inbreeding. They were both heirs and warnings, living evidence of a brotherhood destroying itself. From their short, painful lives emerged the undeniable truth. The Fugates had pushed their bloodline past endurance. The sons of collapse marked the near-final stage of a dynasty consuming itself from within. By the 1970s, the Fugate dynasty had reached its inevitable end. Generations of inward unions had consumed their strength. Sons faltered, brothers weakened, and grandfathers watched as the bloodline slowly collapsed upon itself. Charlie Fugate, centerpiece of their decline, had grown old. His body bent, his mind never advanced beyond simplicity, yet he remained symbol of their heritage. To the outside world, he was tragedy. Doctors who studied him described genetic ruin unprecedented among humans. His chromosomes carried damage beyond repair, his bloodline resembling a closed circle. Yet the Fugates still lifted him as proof of chosen endurance. By 1975, Charlie's health deteriorated rapidly. His heart weakened, his lungs failed, and his frame crumbled under decades of suffering. Surrounded by brothers, sons, and grandsons, he breathed his final breath. His death echoed across the hollows. Fathers wept, grandfathers bowed their heads, and brothers spoke solemnly of legacy. For them, Charlie was not collapse, but culmination of centuries of chosen loyalty. Outsiders, however, recorded him as anomaly. Medical men described him as the most inbred human ever documented, his inbreeding coefficient surpassing levels even seen in controlled laboratory experiments. He became case study, not man. Charlie's sons, themselves broken by deformities, did not long outlive him. Many died young, their bodies unable to sustain collapse. The dynasty shrank until only scattered remnants remained in forgotten cabins. By the 1990s, the last known carriers of concentrated Fugate blood died quietly. Their graves, unmarked or overgrown, marked the close of a lineage that had endured nearly 2 centuries of self-destruction. The hollows of Kentucky fell silent. Cabins were abandoned, fields reclaimed by forest, trails covered by time. Only whispers remained, of blue men who once lived apart, bound only to each other. Yet science never forgot them. Charlie's preserved blood samples remain in laboratories, studied as examples of how far genetics can collapse when diversity disappears. His name endures in textbooks as living caution. For geneticists, Charlie represented the limit of survival. He was proof that men could survive extreme inbreeding, but only temporarily. Beyond a point, collapse consumed everything, leaving nothing but fragile ruins. For the Fugates themselves, memory persisted as pride. Brothers told tales of endurance, fathers spoke of chosen blood, and uncles remembered Charlie not as horror, but as proof of loyalty unbroken. Modern medicine traces lessons back to these men. Genetic counseling exists partly because of their collapse. Doctors use Charlie's profile to warn others of the dangers of turning bloodlines inward. Yet beyond science lies haunting truth. Charlie was not accident. He was created by choices. Every union between brothers, every binding arranged by grandfathers, every vow sworn by sons produced him. The Fugates were not victims alone. They were architects of collapse, builders of their own ruin. Charlie was the last monument of their devotion, the embodiment of a dynasty that destroyed itself. When the last brother fell, the cycle ended. No more blue suns, no more twisted unions, no more oaths sworn in secret hollows. Silence replaced voices that once swore eternal loyalty. Still the story endures. Locals whisper of blue men wandering mountains, of sons born wrong, of a dynasty bound to itself. Science remembers Charlie as warning. History remembers him as final chapter. The last brother falls, and with him, an entire bloodline vanished into the soil of Kentucky. What remains is legacy, a cautionary tale of men who turned inward until nothing remained.